Hi there, Mr. Poi, and we're reading the Egypt Game, Chapter 21, The Hero. Afterwards, getting to the police station and the first things that happened, there were always hazy in April's mind. There was a doctor who talked to her and bandaged her hands where she had scraped them on the rough board. Then there were questions. She explained how she and Marshall happened to be in the alley, but the other questions she couldn't answer, and it frightened her to try. Who was he? They kept saying. What did he look like? Where did he go? And April could only say, I don't know. I didn't see him. I don't know. They tried to make her lie down on a cot, but she kept wanting to get up because she was shaking so hard. Whenever she tried to lie still, the shaking would get worse and worse until she ached from trying to stop it. Then the doctor gave her a pill and the shaking got a little better and things were clearer in her mind. Suddenly she remembered about Marshall. Where's Marshall? She asked. Is he all right? The man who had been asking the most questions was called Inspector Grant. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but he was a policeman. When April asked about Marshall, he grinned. He's fine, he said. He's right in the next room over there. He's really all right? April insisted. He's not too scared or anything? Well, he doesn't act a bit scared, the inspector said. He's sitting in there on a desk holding a big stuffed octopus and looking as cool as a cucumber. But he won't answer any questions. Won't he talk to anybody? April said. Oh, he talks to us, Inspector Grant said. He's been asking us a lot of questions, in fact. He just won't answer any. Every time we ask anything, he just says no. We think he might have seen more than you did. Do you suppose he'd answer a few questions if you ask him? He might, April said. I don't know. When Marshall saw April, he slid down off the desk and came running. Hi, he said, giving her one of his rare starry smiles. April hugged him hard. Then she asked what the inspector had told her to ask. Marshall, did you see the man who grabbed me? Saying the words made the shaking start all over again. Yes, Marshall said. I saw him. I tried to yell, but I couldn't. My throat was stuck. He looked worried, as if he wanted to be sure that April understood. You did fine, April told him. But about the man, what did he look like? A man. A big man. Was he young or old? Marshall thought a minute. Old, he said. What color was his hair? Orange. April looked at Inspector Grant. Ask him about his race, the policeman prompted. Was he a black or a white man? April asked. No, Marshall said thoughtfully, shaking his head. April thought he didn't understand. She took his arm and rubbed her finger on his skin. Was his skin like yours or like mine? She held out her own arm. No, Marshall said more firmly. He was spotted. Would you know him if you saw him again? Inspector Grant interrupted. Marshall only looked at him without answering. The inspector gave an exasperated sigh and turned to April. He's not just being stubborn, April explained. I think he just wants to be sure he isn't telling a secret. Marshall never tells secrets. She turned to Marshall and repeated the question. Marshall nodded. Yes, I know him. Just then, there was a commotion at the door, and Inspector Grant stood up. April wasn't sure if he heard Marshall say, He's that man who carries things at the store. The inspector hurried to the door, and April heard him say, The boy says he'd know the man if he saw him. There was more talk and confusion, and finally a man was led into the room. It was the professor. April was sure it was the professor, but he looked quite different from her memory of him. His hair was mussed, his face moved nervously, and the dead calm was gone from his eyes. He looked at Marshall, and Marshall looked at him. Hello, Marshall said. The inspector took hold of April's arm and whispered a question. She gazed at the professor in horror. Could it have been? Had he really been the one all that time? All that time while they were playing every day in his yard? Obediently, but with a shaky voice, she transferred the question to Marshall. Marshall, is that the man? Is that the one who grabbed me? No, Marshall said. That's the man who watches us all the time. He was looking out his window, like always. He was the one who said help. The professor smiled wearily. That's what I've been trying to tell you. But now Marshall realized that they still hadn't understood. He shook April's arm to get her attention and explained it all again as patiently as he could. I told you, he said. I told you who it was. It was that spotted man with orange hair, the one who carries things at the toy store. At last, April understood. "Oh," she said, "I think he means that red-headed man who works for Mr. Schmidt sometimes. He's a stock boy or something." Two of the policemen hurried off, and Inspector Grant led April back to the other room and told her to lie down again and rest. This time Marshall came with them and climbed up on a chair beside the cot. He put security on his lap and looked around with interest. Seeing him there made April feel calmer. She lay on the cot and tried to keep from shivering, and she tried not to think about the red-headed man. Instead, she thought about the professor. "Marshall," she said, raising up on one elbow, "did you say the professor's been watching us?" Marshall nodded. "Out his window," he said, "and he broke it with the stick and said, 'Help.' I couldn't. My throat was stuck." It gave April a funny feeling to think that they'd been watched all that time, or at least whenever the professor felt like it. But it was certainly a good thing he'd been watching tonight. It was a good thing he said help, as Marshall put it. The inspector, who was sitting at the other end of the cot, broke in as if he could read her thoughts. "It was certainly lucky that the old man was there to shout for help," he said. "You know that's the best thing to do in a situation like that. Your voice is your best defense." "But I couldn't call," April said, covering her face and trying not to remember so vividly the fingers across her mouth and throat. Inspector Grant leaned over and patted her shoulder. "I know," he said soothingly, "but it's all over now, and it all worked out just fine, didn't it? You're all right, and Marshall here has been a real detective." "Why did they think the professor did it?" April asked after a while. "Well, they weren't sure, of course," the inspector said, "but some of the officers thought he was a pretty good suspect, living right there in the neighborhood, and he couldn't give us an alibi for the nights when the other times, and then tonight, with it happening right in his backyard and all. And when some of the boys went to the door of his store and he came running out looking wild-eyed and excited, it seemed best to bring him in for questioning at least. He told them he'd called for help from his window, but I guess they weren't buying his story much, until Marshall stood up for him." It was then that Caroline came in. She ran across the room and hugged April up into her arms and held her tight. When April realized that Caroline was crying, she began to cry too. She hadn't cried at all until then, and she really didn't want to, but when they both stopped crying, the tension was gone and the shaking, and she felt much better. She was suddenly very tired and sleepy. "Grandma," she said, "would you ask them if we can go home now? I'm terribly tired." To Marshall's delight, they rode home in a police car, and they left a note on the Ross's door because they weren't back from the concert yet. It was amazing to April to think that so little time had passed. It seemed like years and years. In their own apartment, they made a bed for Marshall on the couch, and he went right off to sleep as if nothing had happened, with his arm around security. April went to bed too, but it took her a long time to get to sleep, and Caroline sat beside the bed until she finally did. April always hated to be fussed over, but it was sort of nice to just open her eyes now and then and see Caroline just sitting there, quietly reading a book. Of course, the math didn't get done, but as it turned out, it really didn't matter because April stayed home from school the next day, and her grandmother took the day off too. April was feeling fine except for the bandages on her hands and some bruises on her cheeks and ribs. In the afternoon, the police came to take her back to the station to look at some men in the lineup. She wasn't much help because she really hadn't seen the man at all. But Marshall had to go, and he wanted April to come too, and the police seemed to think that she might remember something that would be useful. When the men came in for the lineup, there was the big stocky man with red hair and blotchy red-brown freckles from Schmidt's variety store, the one who was the stock boy, and Marshall pointed to him right away. April remembered that when she had seen him in the store, he had seemed quiet and shy, and in the lineup he looked bewildered, as if he didn't understand what had happened. The next day, it was all in the papers. The red-headed man had admitted everything. There wasn't going to be a real trial because the man was very sick mentally and was going to be sent to a hospital for the criminally insane. He was a relative of Mr. Schmidt, and he always had something wrong with his mind. He couldn't get a good job, and sometimes Mr. Schmidt let him work as a stock boy in his storeroom. He'd work for a while, and then he'd go away and do something else. But he always came back again, and since he was willing to work for very little money, Mr. Schmidt always hired him again. The police hadn't found out about him before because Mr. Schmidt had always given him an alibi. But when the red-headed man confessed and told about all the things he couldn't have known unless he was guilty, Mr. Schmidt decided that he hadn't been positive of his cousin's whereabouts at the times of the crimes. He only thought he knew. April's picture was in the paper, and so was Marshall's. There was a long story about how Marshall had saved the professor from being unjustly accused and described the murderer so that the police were able to catch him. But April and Melanie were a little bit disgusted with the way the reporter talked about Marshall's description. After all, he was spotted in a way, and his hair was more orange than anything else. He really wasn't old, as Marshall had said, but, as Melanie pointed out, when you're only 4 yourself, almost anybody's old by comparison. Anyway, Marshall was a real hero around the neighborhood. Everybody wanted to see him and ask him questions about what happened. The Rosses tried to keep him home for a while because they said they didn't want him getting an exaggerated notion of his own importance. But they needn't have worried. Marshall took the whole thing very calmly. In fact, being a hero didn't seem to change him a bit, except for one thing. When the photographer came to take his picture for the paper, Marshall took Security into the bedroom and put him on his bed. He said Security didn't want his picture taken. And after that, he started leaving Security home sometimes when he went places. And before too long, he didn't need to have Security with him at all anymore, excepting to hold on to him at night when he was sleepy. And that's the end of the chapter.